I was feeling healthy otherwise, but just with the constant arrhythmias going into cardiac arrest, it could have been kind of any given moment. And
Mhm.
after a failed ablation where I coded on the table, the physician came out and said, "This is one of the worst hearts I've ever seen. He needs to go back on the transplant list."
What if the most powerful tool in managing a serious diagnosis wasn't just a pill or a procedure, but your own voice? Meet Marc Bains. At 23, a sudden heart failure diagnosis stopped his young adult life in its tracks. Over a decade-long journey to a transplant, he discovered a critical truth. Taking charge of his own narrative and advocating fiercely for his needs was as vital as his medical care. That revelation led him to co-found HeartLife, a national community where patients and caregivers find peer support, education, and a collective voice. He also co-leads the Canadian Heart Function Alliance, a national research network of more than 200 scientists, clinicians, and patient partners working together to transform heart failure care across Canada. His message is simple and strong. You are not your diagnosis. Your story holds power, and you don't have to face it alone. Please welcome Marc Bains. Hi, Marc, and welcome to Let's Talk SADS Live. It's great to have you on today. You and I have crossed paths many times over the years. I think you're a very well-known figure within the heart function, heart failure community. But it didn't all start, in the glamour now of where you're at. You've been through the trenches with your own health journey. Maybe you could just start off with sharing with us like your own story. How did you come to be where you are today?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And hey, thanks for having me. And it's great to connect virtually. I know we've met in person, but it's always great to connect again. As you mentioned, my name is Marc Bains. I'm a person with lived experience of heart failure. Before I became an advocate, I was a patient, still am. Before I became a patient, I was a person. I was diagnosed with heart failure at the age of 23. Unexpected diagnosis, to say the least. I had just graduated university. I had traveled around the world for 6 months and gotten into my first career. So really, I was entering the adult phase of my life, as I like to call it. I had a cold. The cold then turned into what I thought was a flu. I went to my family doctor, and he said, "Mark, yeah, do you know what? It might be a flu mixed with childhood asthma, potentially some bronchitis." Interesting. I mean, it was kind of like mid-July, but sometimes you just get sick. So I got sent home with an inhaler, listened to my family doc, as we are normally taught to do, and then went on. But when I went on, I got progressively worse. So over the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I had trouble breathing, which never happened before. I was very active. I had trouble walking up my stairs without catching my breath. And if I made it upstairs, I couldn't lie on my bed because all I was doing was coughing. Little did I know I had fluid in my lungs. And when the chest pain started, that's when I went for a second opinion. And after, about 6 to 8 hours in the emergency department, some tests that I've had before, X-ray, of course, blood work, some that I had, an ECG, a echo, which is the ultrasound of the heart. The emergency physician came back with the cardiologist, very concerned look on their face, said, "Mark, you have dilated cardiomyopathy. Your ejection fraction is 5 to 10%. You're in heart failure."
Wow.
Yeah. My first question was, am I going to die? Because I had no idea what they meant. It was the first time heart and failure were used in the same sentence. They said no, but we had a lot of work to do. And that began my journey into heart failure itself.
How long did you live with heart failure until you had your heart transplant?
I lived with heart failure for 10 years. So I lived with heart failure. I mean, I had my ups and downs like many people do with heart failure. So I was in the hospital. Actually, from the time I was diagnosed, I was transferred to VGH from a smaller hospital where I had my diagnosis. I was in hospital for just about 2 weeks. Then I was discharged on optimal therapy. Needless to say, I was back in the hospital within 30 days with worsening heart failure, if you can imagine that, and then arrhythmia. I then had an ICD implanted at my second visit to the hospital. was put on the transplant list the first time, subsequently taken off in the spring, but then lived with heart failure for 10 years. Again, ups and downs, going through cardiac arrest, good times, really good times where I was able to get back to work, travel, do the things I wanted to do, but some tough times where my family lost me as well. But then ultimately put back on the transplant list in 2017 and my transplant June 6, 2018.
Wow. So you were a young guy at 23. I mean, your life is ahead of you. How did that change sort of the trajectory of your life to get these diagnoses?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, as I mentioned, I was just entering the adult phase of my life. So entering my first career in sales, everything stopped. Everyone else moved on, but my life was at a standstill. I wasn't able to work. I wasn't able to do the activities or the sports I wanted to do anymore. And it just didn't impact me, it impacted my family as well. Had to change my complete diet and everything that I was doing. So it really was a new normal, as we like to say in heart failure.
And what was the cause of it?
So initially, it was idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathy, meaning they were unknown. At first, again, being 23, it was how much did I drink, how many drugs did I do, or what kind of drugs I did. I was a social drinker, yes. I didn't do any drugs until they started to give them to me in the hospital. But, ruled that out. So it had to be idiopathic. It was a cold virus that attacked my heart. Fast forward to 2023, where 2022, 2023, my wife and I decide that we want to start a family. So I contact the Inherited Arrhythmia Clinic and say, I want to do genetic testing. We do that. Turns out my heart failure was genetic. Yeah.
Wow. And what genes did they discover, and what is the label that you got given?
Yeah, so it's the DSP gene, you know what, I won't even attempt to say it, but the DSP gene, I'm sure I could look it up and get you the information, but a genetic mutation that causes a dilated cardiomyopathy or an arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. They're actually not sure which one came first with me, considering they removed my heart and transplanted it.
And did you have any signs growing up? Like, were you an active boy and a teenager? Did you look back and see any warning signs?
No, I did not. No, I was very active. I was very healthy. The gene itself, which is desmoplankin, actually starts to present itself in the mid to late 20s. So no issues prior to that.
Right. So you get the heart failure diagnosis, you live for 10 years, some challenges, some good times. And then what led it to the doctors to put you back on the transplant list?
So it really actually came down to the arrhythmias. The electrical system in my heart began to fail. I was going into cardiac arrest I think between 2016 and 2018 was almost 9 different times. A few of those times where I needed CPR. Fortunate for me, and I don't know why, I tend to hang around with a lot of nurses. 2 events happened at wedding parties. I kind of became known as the wedding crasher. People still invited me. I'm not sure why, but they did. But that was the challenge. So, I was feeling healthy otherwise, but just with the constant arrhythmias going into cardiac arrest, it could have been kind of any given moment. And after a failed ablation where I coded on the table, the physician came out and said, this is one of the worst hearts I've ever seen. He needs to go back on the transplant list.
Wow.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So when did you get your transplant, and how did that change your life?
Yeah, I was transplanted on June 6, 2018. So it was 10 months after I was put on the list. It was life-changing. I mean, the first, of course, 6 months were a bit of a challenge, and it differs for everyone, right? Going through transplant. I was in and out of the hospital in 8 days post-transplant. That said, I had on and off rejection for 6 months. So it was a bit of a challenge. That recovery is not easy. and it takes a lot of support and people around you. But post 6 months, game changer, feel completely different as an individual, back to health, back to doing the things you want to do, back to career, just a new person. So very grateful for that second chance at life.
That's great. Now, you have made a huge impact, I think, in the Canadian patient advocacy realm. Tell us what got you into that. Why have you devoted yourself to this? And, how did this come about for you to engage in this way?
So, I mean, why I became an advocate, and, thinking about the impact that we've had as an organization, we really have to take a step back and look at it, and where it began. I think it was early on in my diagnosis when my cardiologist had introduced me to two other patient partners through a nursing partner, and then my cardiologist, two other patient partners who had lived through what I was going to go through. One had heart failure and then a left ventricular assist device. One had heart failure, then a heart transplant. When I met these individuals, I realized that heart failure doesn't have to define who I am. I can live the quality of life I deserve with the right tools, the right resources, the right support. And so that began my journey of advocacy. I said, hey, you know what? I want to be a peer mentor for someone. I want to be involved. I know I was still early in my diagnosis, but I think there was an opportunity. So I started working with Cardiac Services BC on reviewing resources that were patient-facing, then got involved with developing resources, then became a patient partner on their board. That led me, fast forward 2016, to a national roundtable on heart failure, where I think the first time Canadians were talking about heart failure in a coordinated way. We have patients, caregivers, industry professionals, associations, physicians, organized by Heart and Stroke Foundation. And at the time, there were 650,000 Canadians living with heart failure, 50,000 new diagnoses every year. And there's two patient partners at the table, myself and Jillian Code, co-founder of HeartLife. And we said, why are we the only two people here? Where is everyone else getting support? And at the time for heart failure, there was nowhere. So we went into the hotel lobby that evening and we said, we should start something. And that's when HeartLife was born, really as a Facebook group that day in the Sheraton in Montreal post first meeting. And that's how HeartLife was born. And over the years, we turned into this full-fledged advocacy organization that engages, educates, and empowers. And, to your question, why? Because we have the opportunity to do so. We were at a stage where we could put this forward and support other people, where other people might not necessarily have that opportunity.
Yeah. You're still a pretty young person. I despite my age on my birth certificate, I feel like I'm a young person. I was diagnosed with heart failure 11 years ago. Why is it important that people who present health, they look like they're a healthy person, they may be on the younger side of the spectrum? Why is it important that they get involved and they reach out and they build community when they live with heart failure?
I think when we think about community on heart failure, or you think about heart failure in general, or cardiovascular disease for that matter, it's an invisible disease, right? I mean, if someone saw you and I walking down the street, they wouldn't think that we had heart failure. They wouldn't think that this is a struggle for us to do. So it is invisible. And so people feel alone. They don't feel supported. So that community, that peer-to-peer support really brings that together. It's that, hey, there's other people out there like me that are going through some of the same things I'm going through, that have been through it and have got out on the other side, or are finding ways to have this new normal, but live the quality of life they deserve. So I think that's why this community is so important.
So in addition to your advocacy with HeartLife, you are part of the Canadian Heart Function Alliance, which you also co-founded. So talk to me about that and how patients can become partners in research.
Yeah, honestly, sometimes I feel like I have imposter syndrome. So I co-lead the Canadian Heart Function Alliance with Dr. Jean Rouleau out of the Montreal Heart Institute. It was a 5-year grant put through by the Canadian Institute for Health Research and Heart and Stroke Foundation. And we really look at the prevention, diagnosis, and management of heart failure. We have over 200 researchers, over 80 patient partners involved, covering different aspects, all the way from pediatrics, genetics, all the way to advanced heart failure care in aging populations. So it really covers a broad spectrum of research, and just very grateful to be involved, but really sets the stage for how research can be done in this country, with collaborating and really partnering with people with lived experience. So of course I'm co-lead, which is fantastic, but then other 80 patient partners that we have are in different roles in research, whether it's forming research questions, being involved in governance on teams, looking at recruitment for research and how to support that and retention, or even knowledge mobilization. All these things, opportunities where patient partners can be involved. But we know it's not easy. So what we do, we have a whole patient engagement team associated with the Alliance, where we provide workshops, we provide webinars, we provide education sessions on how to meaningfully engage in research, not just for patients, but for researchers as well, so they have an understanding and the confidence to actually engage patient partners.
Yeah, I've noticed, and I'm sure, because you're leading this group, but I've also noticed there's been a big uptick and transition from not being at the table to now getting welcome to the table for research. What are some of the things, though, that you would point out for a patient who wants to become involved in research? There's some tips? Are there some challenges? Where do you see that going?
Don't be scared to be involved in research. I think having that lived experience voice is essential for the way future care is going to be developed, right? I mean, there's a famous saying, it's not mine, it's nothing about us without us, right? That patient partners who want to be involved in research have to know, believe, and understand that their voice does matter. And when you're going into being involved in research, there's many opportunities with that. As I alluded to, it could be anywhere from developing a research protocol to how do we effectively communicate results. There's not a one shop fits all, but there's many opportunities for people to look at. But be well equipped as a patient partner when you want to be involved in research. There are training modules out there, there's education out there to really empower you to be effective in your research. And as you're a participant, you don't always have to volunteer either, right? As someone with a lived experience of heart failure and transplant and an advocate, I come with a business background in entrepreneurial leadership, right? My co-founder Jillian's an associate professor in the Faculty of Education. So we have these experiences, we're spending our time, and we should have that acknowledged and even compensated, right? So patient partners shouldn't feel like this should just be a volunteer role, because they are providing a lot of value.
Absolutely. So I want to get back into sort of more the personal side, mindset. Do you think advocating for yourself and being involved with this research had a positive impact on the outcomes of your health?
That's a great question. Yes, definitely yes. The reason why I thought about the question, I think about my little sister. She's 27 years old. She has the gene as well. She has pericarditis, inflammation of the heart, on and off, and regularly utilizes HeartLife as her main point of contact when she goes into the hospital, saying, "Hey, I got this information from HeartLife, and this has helped support her care." And so, but for me, being involved in HeartLife, continuing to push forward on education resources, personally, I then have to walk the walk that I talk the talk for. People remind me of that often. But I think that overall advocacy, whether it's peer-to-peer connections, education from a patient point of view, for patients, by patients, supports an improvement in care overall.
And these can be, as you say, they look hidden, right? Like people don't know, but it can also feel very isolating, especially if you're newly diagnosed. If you've just heard the worst from your physician, and now you're changing your life. You've lost maybe the identity that you had previous. How important do you think is community in what you do, and having people support one another?
Yeah, I think that's of utmost importance, and that really sets the foundation for people's care moving forward. And it's multifaceted support. It's from peers. It's from the community, so people living with the disease. It is from our healthcare team that should take an empathetic approach to care, to really understand that whole person, not just the disease they're living with. And I think just overall, public consideration about what cardiovascular disease is and how it impacts patients and caregivers. I mean, we can't lose caregivers in this, because anything with cardiovascular disease really affects the entire community. But I mean, that peer-to-peer connection, and we see it day in and day out at HeartLife, whether it's on our Zoom meetings where anyone can join and have a conversation, or it's in our Facebook group where a new member joins, has a question, and then there's 14 comments that answers that question immediately. Those people feel like they're not alone, right? They start to get an understanding that they're not alone. I think this is even more important in racialized communities as well as rural and remote communities. I mean, I was diagnosed in Vancouver at 3 major heart centers within 20 minutes of my house, but I was the exception and not the rule. We need to make sure that when we provide support, when we provide resources, when we do education, when we do engagement, it's for all people living in Canada with the disease, not just those who have access to these already.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think set you up for this? I mean, when you look back at the way you were raised, the values that were important in your family, I mean, this is a pretty big act of service. You have an entrepreneurial background. You could be out there with your businesses and not doing any of this.
Yeah. That's true.
What do you look back and see anything that may have, lessons learned from your parents or other mentors that sort of set you up to do this?
It's a great question. No one's ever asked me that question. And thinking back, I always grew up in a diverse community, in a community where people were always getting together. They were always supporting each other, and that helped me as an individual evolve. So part of what I do is bring people together, bring that community together to help people grow, because I think that we can all climb the ladder at the same time, whether that's in health to get healthier, or whether that's in career to advance our careers. It's not a zero-sum game, in my opinion. It's, if we work together, we can all be better. Another proverb that I've always stuck with is, if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. And so I think that togetherness is an approach we need to take in advocacy. And then I'll relate it back to, and not so much growing up and, the principles and morals I developed from my family, my friends, my community. But when that nursing partner saw me in the hospital struggling and then told my cardiologist he needs to talk to someone, and those are 2 patient partners, that really did change my mindset, right? That, hey, this is so impactful. How do we do this for other folks?
Yeah, that was pretty much serendipity.
Yeah.
But you and Jillian together.
Yeah, for sure.
So what about the stories that, we tell ourselves? Because, how we present ourselves really, I think, determines how we see ourselves, what our identity is. Talk a little bit about, the way that you tell your story and how important that is in terms of your own feeling of autonomy, self-empowerment.
Yeah. Another great question, and I'll use a recent example. I mean, my story's evolved over time. I've told my story many times, early on in diagnosis, a few years into heart failure, living with the disease, going into advanced heart failure, how it is with the device, and then into transplant. And every time it's a little bit different. There was a few years where I didn't get deep into my story, where it was more about the organization, what we do, very brief. Yes, living with heart failure survivor, transplant, started HeartLife, here we go. But I was recently invited to do a keynote, and it was about 20 minutes long, and it was focused primarily on my story. So I really had to take a step back and reflect on the last, 17 years and get that down into this 20-minute story that would create impact for this organization. And it's not holding back, it's really being vulnerable about the story, but also, sharing not just the downs, but also the ups. right? Because there was a lot of ups along the way that got me through some of the toughest times. Emphasizing the different aspects of my care, who was involved, what it took to, get to this new normal and live the quality of life I deserve. And my three things that I always try to do is I try to make people laugh, I try to make them cry, and I try to make them think. So if I can have some provocative messages around that, I think I've done my job.
That's a great standard. Wow. So just, to wrap up, what are some of the resources that patients and caregivers can find within HeartLife and the Canadian Heart Function Alliance? What should they be looking for? What's offered? What's coming up next? I think you guys have some exciting stuff coming up.
Yeah, we do. We sure. I mean, when we think about, thinking about the Canadian Heart Function Alliance, and from that, we've developed the HeartLife Hub, which is a research platform for education and resources. But all that can be found through heartlife.ca or even heartlife.global as we continue our expansion from Canada to the US and across the globe. But we have resources on not just heart failure, so we're all cardiovascular disease, but multiple diseases, whether that's dyslipidemia or amyloidosis, and even thinking about connected conditions, how diabetes connects to heart disease, what that looks like, or kidney disease, for example. We have these patient-facing, medically reviewed resources, as well as HeartLife Academy, which is an online learning platform, which is free of charge, where we bring in an expert talking about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and then patient partners sharing their story. We have 12 courses available there. And of course, back to our support groups online, where really anyone living with a cardiovascular disease can join. We just refreshed our entire brand, so you're going to see all new stuff from HeartLife across the space, along with a recently launched Heart Function Guide, which is a all guide to heart function, and then a new patient passport, which is really for people to capture their data and be in control and be engaged and empowered when they're living with multiple conditions.
That's great. There's a lot of great resources. So we really encourage everyone listening to go and check it out. So Marc, I really want to thank you for sharing your personal story, for your tireless advocacy on our behalf. Those of us living with heart failure really appreciate you and Jillian and all your efforts. One last question. What are you looking forward to? What's on your personal horizon? Is there something coming up? What gives you hope and optimism?
Yeah, it's my wife and I had our daughter Mara, and she's 2 years and 4 months, full of character, full of life, full of zest, and we continue to watch her grow and evolve, and it's so exciting for us to see this evolution of this human being. So really looking forward to that and watching her grow, and then all the things that we can do for HeartLife, for SADS and the community in general. And I'll say that even just this podcast, we were so grateful for the opportunity, to share my story, to share information about HeartLife, but also then partner with groups like SADS, who are doing amazing things in the space, and really is partnerships that will all help us grow together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
No, thank you. I appreciate the time.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.